So welcome back to our last session this afternoon on health data and narrative approaches. Our first speaker is Professor Duncan Stewart, who will be talking about working with big data. So Duncan, if you are okay with your slides? Yes, you are. We can see it, Duncan. Thank you.
Thank you for letting me know.
Yes, you can start, Duncan. It's your time.
Okay. Brilliant. Thank you very much. Okay, well, nice to that everyone's joined us this afternoon. I know this is the last session, so hang on in. There's lots of interesting stuff to come. I'm going to talk about working with big data, and I'm going to start with a confession. I'm not an expert in big data as such. What I'm going to do is tell you a little bit about my experiences of working with some form of big data and some of the pros and cons of big data for doing research. So what exactly do we mean by big data? Well, I quite like this definition from the UCL Big Data Institute. So big data is a general term referring to the huge volume and variety of data which have become ubiquitous in government, society, and science. I think, when you think about big data, I think big really refers just to the volume of it. So we're talking about big, gigantic data sets. And if you think about it, much of what we do now does leave some kind of digital footprint. And, in general, those data can be analysed. Now, the really important thing for this presentation, this is going to frame pretty much everything else I say, is that these data aren't designed for research, but they have potential research value. And so the trick or the dilemma for researchers is balancing what we really want to be able to do, the questions we really want to be able to ask, and what's actually possible to do with these data sets that are designed for very specific, often administrative purposes and not really research. And so that constrains what we can reasonably do with them. So there is a balancing act, a trade-off to be done. And that poses all sorts of difficulties and challenges. Why is big data of interest to researchers? Well, quite apart from the scale of it, it's actually much cheaper than creating data for research, especially at large scale. So, if we're talking about thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people potentially in these data sets, and obviously if you wanted to go and survey those kinds of numbers, it would be prohibitively expensive. So here we have massive data sets that potentially on tap that are much cheaper to access. And that large scale means you can actually look at things that are relatively rare, and this is particularly useful if you're interested in particular types of disease or health problem. And if you use these data, they're actually quite useful to be able to combine with other forms of data and collected with more traditional methods, and you get a full picture of a particular research problem. I mentioned challenges a minute ago. There are lots. This is a very broad summary. So first of all is access. So there are large data sets available, often linked to or owned by government, and you can't just sort of click a switch and access it. You usually have to apply for it, and in the process of application, you have to fulfil various criteria. So they're not just going to hand over the data to anybody. You generally have to be able to justify what it is you want to do and why you want to do it. And so there's a kind of a bureaucracy associated with it. And whilst it's cheaper than doing large surveys, there is still a cost attached. So money is involved, and the more data you access, generally, the more expensive it becomes. The other thing, as a researcher, you really need to understand the utility of these data as a research resource. Just because it's there doesn't necessarily mean all of it's any good. for addressing the question that you want answered. And data linkage can be difficult to achieve. So one of the attractions of big data is accessing data from one source and matching it to data from another source. And that can be really, really complex. So to give you an example, around about 15 years ago, so I was a researcher in the Ministry of Justice. And at that time, there was a lot of activity around trying to work out how to link all the data sets across the entire criminal justice system to one big data set. And you can imagine how useful that might be for managing the criminal justice system in the round and developing policy, etc. And it's only now, 15 years later, that data is actually, they've managed to do that, and that data is now available for researchers to use. So it gives an indication that the potential complexities and timescales involved in creating these data sets and linking them. And last but not least, and this is probably more pertinent to my experience, is it requires a whole new set of skills. And actually, the analysis of data isn't really the challenge. It's actually the processing of it that's very, very difficult. And if you're new to it, it's extremely difficult. And that was my experience of doing so. So I'm going to give you an example that I was involved with to illustrate some of these issues. So I use this data source called the Clinical Practice Research Data Link, or CPRD. This is based from electronic general practice records, so the records that your GP stores about you and everybody else in the population. Now, GPs use different types of software, surprise, surprise, so you can't get access to all of it with one particular type of software, but the CPRD has approximately 60 million patients, data on approximately 60 million patients, of whom around 16 million are alive and still registered with their GP. And that data contains anonymised information on patients' diagnoses, tests, treatments, prescriptions, referrals, etc. Pretty much everything that happens in a GP surgery. Now, this data is widely used internationally for epidemiological research. I think there are around about 30,000 peer-reviewed. I mean, no, not 30,000, maybe like 10,000 peer-reviewed publications based on this data set, this source of data. So it is used a lot out there. But as I said earlier, you can't just access this data. You actually need there's an approval process. There's a committee that oversees your application to use it, and there's a fee that can range from about 40 grand for a bespoke data set for a specific study up to a couple of 100,000 for access to the whole thing on an annual basis. So, I said it's cheaper than doing a large survey, but it's not cheap necessarily. Now, if you can imagine, you've got millions of people you can access all their clinical data, and you've got thousands of academics publishing all sorts of interesting stuff with this data. You can see the allure of potentially using this data for someone like me who's interested in health sciences and health problems and the NHS, etc. So it does feel like a bit like a candy store. When you look at it outside, instead of those jars of sweets, you could see journal articles in prominent publications like the Lancet and the BMJ, and sort of, it all looks terrifically inviting. But I'm afraid the reality is a bit more like this. And in the sense that actually once you get the data, it's extremely difficult to navigate your way around it. It's very easy to get lost, and actually pretty much all of it is self-assembly, in the sense that you don't just get the data and it's ready to go. There's an awful lot of work you need to do with it, and let me show you what I mean. So this is what a CPRD data set looks like. And actually, it's several individual data sets that you physically have to link. So you've got information on every single consultation with every patient in the data set, and that's linked to broader clinical records for symptoms, diagnoses. There's other information about people's height, weight, smoking, drinking, etc. Patient background information, practice background information, and then information on specific tests that have been done or referrals to other services, and a whole separate data set on prescriptions. So these little arrows in the diagram are the bits you have to do. In a sense, it doesn't come like this. And part of the difficulty is that you actually have to, in each of these, if you want to link all of these things together, you actually have to identify exactly what kind of data you need and the precise individuals you want the data for, and you need to do that for each data set separately, and then hope that they all match when you try and link them together. And the problem is, if one thing goes wrong, it all goes wrong. So the process is really time consuming and complex, in terms of arriving at the information you want to analyze to answer your research question. Another issue with all GP records is completeness of data. And this graph just illustrates the kind of gives some examples of the degree to which data is missing in the general practice records, how it changes over time as well. But it is an issue, and of course you might end up with start with 10 million people in your data set, but if data is missing for half of it, it kind of creates issues of bias and how representative your sample is and the reasons for those missing data, etc. So those are things you need to take into account. So in other words, it's an imperfect. These data are imperfect. So GPs don't record everything, and actually some of the things they record, they don't record particularly well. So there is still that human element to deal with. Now, the study I'm going to give very specific kind of background about, which I use this CPRD data for. There's a study of all-cause mortality, so causes of death, specifically in relation to alcohol consumption. So I had access to quite a small subsample of the bigger CPRD data set, but this sample was specifically for people with long-term conditions, and you can see there the range of conditions that involves. And we were particularly interested in examining the relationship between alcohol consumption and the extent to which that increases the risk of mortality amongst people who are already ill. So there's a heightened mortality risk expected in this population, so people with long-term conditions are likely to die earlier. And what we were interested in is whether alcohol consumption confers an additional risk of premature death. And we did some modelling around that, but the important thing about this is we controlled for a range of demographic and clinical covariates, so in addition to alcohol consumption. And the average time at which people were at risk in this study, risk of dying, about 8 years. We followed people up to 14 years, but the average was 8. Now, I'm going to give you just 2 slides of results, just to give you a flavour of the kind of things that we managed to find with this data set. So, we did find that the more these people drank, the greater the risk of premature death. But we're quite interested in some of the complexities of the relationship. So this graph shows you the risk of mortality amongst drinkers by smoking status. So that the horizontal axis is categories of alcohol consumption. So this is units consumed per week. It ranges from 1 to 35 plus. And the column you want to look at is the red column, because these are the smokers. So smoking, unsurprisingly, was related to premature death. But the really interesting thing was that the more people drank, the greater the risk of death amongst the smokers. So in other words, alcohol was amplifying the risk conferred in terms of smoking status. So amongst smokers, the more they drank, the greater the risk of dying early. And we did the same type of analysis, but this time looking at deprivation. So we compared people in the most deprived areas. So people were categorised by the index of multiple deprivation quintiles. So we looked at people, compared people in the most deprived areas compared to everybody else, and you get the same kind of pattern. So we know that deprivation is associated with premature death, and that was confirmed in this sample of people who were already chronically ill. But again, increased levels of alcohol consumption made that worse. It increased the risk, increased the effect of deprivation on premature death. If you're going to summarise those specific results using these GP records as a source of data, we concluded that heavy drinkers amongst general practice patients with long-term conditions die younger than lighter drinkers. That's not a surprise. But of course, there are these complexities. The smoking and deprivation increase the risk of mortality separately. So we look at them separately, they increase the risk of mortality, but they modify the effects of alcohol consumption such that they actually increase the risk of all-cause mortality. What all that adds up to is that alcohol makes the work of the NHS managing these types of long-term conditions much more difficult, and something needs to be done about it. So this kind of illustrates that actually, once you kind of assembled your data set from this very complex to manage source of data, you can do some really interesting analyses with them with big numbers. And this is 96,000. That's people. That's a big number, and you couldn't realistically go and interview 96,000 people. I don't think anyone would give you any money to do that. So it kind of illustrates how you can do something quite simple but quite impactful with this source of data. So some final reflections on what this means for working with big data. But I hope I've given you some hint or indication that these sorts of data sources, be it from general practice or other areas of health or social care. Think about Department of Work and Pensions. I know there's a lot of analysis used with those data, for example. They offer huge potential for research, particularly if you can actually begin to link various data sets together. But it really is not an easy option. If you've got the dilemma between using a big data source or doing a large survey, cost is one issue, but actually there are all sorts of other things to consider. So it certainly isn't an easy option to use these sources of big data. It requires really extensive data processing and an understanding of the way the data are actually originally recorded. And this is at the root of my experience. So I just about managed to do it, but it was very hard work. And I think I used this study as the basis for funding applications to do more work around this issue with these data. And I certainly made sure I involved experts in the data. So GPs, practitioners are actually know the way the data is used and recorded, in addition to experts in processing this data. So if I was ever to do this again, I definitely want to contract the processing bit out to somebody who's really expert in it. These data have significant limitations, particularly the completeness of the data, but also actually a lot of the things in there are fairly superficial, yes, no type variables. So there's a limit to how deep you can dig sometimes with these sorts of data sets. So in my opinion, it's probably best utilised as part of a broader programme of research. So if there's anyone in our university, for example, who is thinking about doing a study involving a big data set, from whatever source or topic, I think it would be important to be mindful of the challenges in terms of managing the data, what the data can actually tell you, and perhaps thinking about that component of research alongside some others, and probably actually alongside involving collaborators who are probably more experienced in using and understanding that specific sort of data. So that's all I've got to say about big data. It's probably a drop in the ocean in terms of what we could talk about with this topic. But anyway, it's just a kind of a personal insight into the trials and tribulations of working with a particular example of big data. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Duncan. Thank you very much. Just on time. So our next presentations, and then we come back, as you know, with questions for Duncan and the following two presenters, is Miranda Turner and Dr. Alan Benson. I need to, first of all, share your presentations. I have it uploaded here. I think we are ready there. Alan and Miranda, are you? I think I have.
Yes, I'm
given
here.
you.
Yep.
And Miranda?
Yeah, I'm here. Hi.
Okay, brilliant. Over to you then.
Right. Hello, everybody. Just a very brief word from me. Miranda's presentation comes out of a research project that she did last year that has traditionally been done at the end of the PGCE course. And its focus has been on school improvement, involving collecting data in schools. This was impossible last year, and as a result of that, what we did was to maintain the research element, but explore avenues of autoethnography, which made a number of things possible that hadn't been possible under the old framework. The old framework really didn't give opportunities for people, for teachers to consider the evolution of their own identity. And I'm very pleased to say that reframing with a different research model, that is autoethnography, allowed Miranda to look at this important issue of being a Black teacher. Over to you, Miranda. Thank you.
Thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. Like I said, my name's Miranda, and today I'm going to discuss what it was like for me becoming a Black teacher on the PGCE course at the London Met. So I've come from quite a strong academic background, completing a degree in business and a master's in international business management at another university. So I didn't feel too anxious about the academic side of the course and the research project. In fact, I felt quite prepared to enter the classroom as a Black British female with Caribbean heritage. The professional studies and my course leader addressed many issues surrounding the education sector, such as the disparities for pupils due to race, religion, or class, and also the role of stereotypes and unconscious biasness and the effect that that could play on a child's achievement. I also learned about the importance of bodies and that it was typical to see white male bodies with higher positions at school. So from early, this made me aware that I was entering a sector where I was a minority without even having to look around at my peers. This all led to me having an early idea for my research project, which had a personal and professional interest, which was to just look at ways in which schools could improve Black pupils' academic achievement. However, studying took me on a journey of my own that I did not even know I needed to make. And when I was thinking that, and when I said that, it was the fact that, like I said, I knew where I wanted or what I needed to research. However, once I started researching and looking into the literature, I started discovering new terminologies and new theories such as adultification, critical race theory, and institutional racism. And what this made me realise was that the disparities were much bigger than just for pupils, but for all Black people in school communities on a whole. In turn, this changed the focus of my research, and after discussions with my course leader, he introduced me to autoethnography studies. So I was allowed to then discuss my journey of becoming a maths teacher within school communities and what that involved for me and personally, what involved for me personally and of course professionally. My course leader pointed me to articles and writings of Nicola Rollock, and it was quite remarkable to actually hear her discuss about things such as microaggressions, and making me realize that some of the ones that I've had experienced or ones that my family had experienced was actually documented academically. So even times when I've actually overlooked them, when I remember my mum telling me a story of do you know, when she was at school, the kids asked her, do you taste like chocolate? And also there was a case when I was at university, and one of my peers came and poked me on my bum, and was like, oh my gosh, I couldn't help myself. I didn't know if it was real. I had to touch it. And these were things that maybe I even laughed at or overlooked at before, but it's only when I started going into schools and I was addressed many a times about my hair, no matter how I wore it, if I wore it in an afro, if I wore it in braids, I was always received some sort of comments. And even from the pupils one time, they said, I swear your hair was long yesterday. And I remember just having a general conversation with my mentor at the time at the school, and she said, she just kind of downplayed it and was like, oh, it's a distraction, your hair's a distraction, the kids are using it as distraction. So I was like, oh, okay, all right, yeah, that makes sense. I'm the distraction, my hairstyle's causing a problem. And then I had another incident at the school where a teacher in the staff room approached me in front of, when I was the only Black person in that staff room, and asked me, does my hair stay still in the windy weather? And I can't even properly convey how I felt when I was asked that question. You know, internally I was feeling shocked and, you know, quite hurt, when externally I had to actually show that it didn't bother me and still give yet a tactful reply. And what it actually made me realize was that microaggressions have not changed much through the generations. So behind these little text, there's actually pictures of myself and my family. Because it's not interactive PowerPoint, you can't see the family behind, but that's actually myself and my son and my mum on the right slide, and that's my mum and her parents and her siblings on the left hand side. So like I said, I actually realized that these microaggressions haven't changed much since my family arrived in the Windrush area. And microaggressions should not be something that's normalized, because personally, it took quite a toll on my mental health, because I found myself looking at the way found myself looking at the way I was dressed and thinking about the way I should present myself, and in a way that, quote unquote, I was not a distraction or not get any comments that would make me feel uncomfortable. So eventually I started seeing myself as a problem. And let's bring that back. I started seeing myself as a problem. And this is the work of W.E. Du Bois, and he's got this concept of double consciousness. And my course leader had introduced me to this already after a bold statement that I wrote in my assignment of being an unapologetic Black female. But where was this boldness now? In fact, I was starting to question myself because of the incidences I was experiencing at school. And what it was showing me is that this double consciousness was now coming into play, because there was a conflict of interest of how I saw myself and how others saw me, standing there being a Black teacher. So let's go to this. So if we think of stereotypes, due to the stereotypes that society has created about Black females, we are often associated as being angry, loud, or aggressive. And when we look at job roles within schools, it's documented that Black people are typically placed in roles which involve behaviour management, control, or run Black History Month events, because we are more suited. But this is not a reflection of who I am. I am not an angry Black female. by an educated body. And for some teachers, we do not want this responsibility of such roles. I do, however, think that Black History Month is important. It's a good way that we can try and combat the negative stereotypes that society has put on to Black people. But I don't see it in the way, but how I see it as a Black History Month, like some sort of tokenism. And I don't think it should be looked at like that, but in fact, looked at is as in Black History Year or incorporated every day. And that would, of course, involve decolonizing the curriculum so that Black history and positive role models are always represented, and so that microaggressions can be tackled and racial literacy can be introduced into classrooms and safe spaces created so that such discussions can occur. So this was something that I was able to do while at the London Met because of the aid of my course leader. Although we were different bodies, he was always there on hand to provide emotional support or some sort of reading for me. Not always that I always liked, but you know, he used to throw these articles at me, and lo and behold, there was something I could actually relate to. So my course leader made it very easy for me to talk to him about race relation issues that I was facing in schools, despite, like I said, our different bodies. But this was a great help in reinventing myself, rediscovering myself, and strengthening my identity, which I was so strongly proclaiming at the beginning of the course, which was slowly being picked at whilst I was doing my placements at school. But this was important, and it's important because he created a platform where I could express myself freely, and he was always able to point me to somewhere or some help. And this is what it needs to be normalized. This needs to be normalized, being able to have a safe space to talk and not playing these things down. So yes, that was my story of becoming a mass PGC at the London Met. Thank you for listening. I just have some references that I addressed as well, some of the stories that I got. So there's some further readings. That's where I got my stuff from as well, and what my course leader passed on to me as well.
Thank you so much, Miranda. Thank you so much. We have a lot of comments to which we're going to come back to after we hear the last speaker, in fact, which is Rachel Dawick and Emma Barker. The title is the English in English. English is in English. So Southern Stories. And I'm trying to, while I read that, I'm trying to also upload the slides.
Oh, I can do it from here if you like. I've got it ready to go if you like. I can do it.
Oh, okay. Brilliant. Thank you. Okay.
Has it worked? Has it worked? Yep, great.
Thank you very much.
It's all right. Right, shall I just, oh no, it's Emma first, sorry.
Just really briefly, I was just going to introduce Rachel Dawick, who completed her PGCE here at London Metropolitan last year in 2020. And a brief introduction, Rachel, just to say that your presentation is drawing on work that you did at the end of the year-long course as part of your synoptic essay on pedagogy in English. I think it's amazingly titled. It is a bit of a tongue twister. The English is in English, Southern Stories, and you're going to draw on your experience of growing up in New Zealand and later teaching and training teachers in Nepal. And Rachel's going to explore the links between the kind of English studied in different parts of the globe and the opportunities or restrictions it places on developing personal identity, specifically looking at writing and the development of voice, and I think through that implicitly linking to mental health. Over to you, Rachel.
Okay, great. Right, I'd just like to start off as a thank you for the opportunity to be part of the conference today. As Emma said, my presentation's focusing really on the importance of ownership in English as a crucial element where empowerment is gained by using language and craft as a means of self-expression. Storytelling I see as a powerful tool, and as a way of reflecting on my own journey as an English teacher, I use the model of a hero's journey, which might be familiar to many, as a structure that enabled me to consider my role as a New Zealander teaching English and what it meant when English had been part of our colonial past. Oops, I'll just see if I can move this, sorry. Yeah. As someone who grew up in a colonized nation, I was aware of there being many kinds of Englishes spoken around the world, both as a first and second language. And the term Englishes suggests this. One view holds that these Englishes are equally correct and valid, and this therefore lessens the importance of a standard English and questions the priority given to British or American English as targets for teaching English across the world. New Zealand English is a result of a colonial past and has evolved from a range of influences, including a range of colonists, as well as the language of the indigenous people, the Māori. Its 200-year-old history makes it a relatively young form of English, and indeed its recognition as a language in its own right, with its own language and literary heritage, has only been in the last couple of decades. When I went through school, you could not study New Zealand literature. Instead, we studied the works that came out of England and America, with BBC English the adopted speech of the well-educated. Alongside this was the idea that literature belonged to an elite class, the literary canon, and as such left no room for new voices. The craft of writing was kept under lock and key, and we were deemed to study the great writers with a degree of awe and wonder. We were to become expert analysts and readers rather than expert writers. It was a form of self-expression that seemed to be denied to us. It was ultimately a form of control, a way of the colonial past maintaining power within education, a way of keeping other voices out. In order to reflect on my journey, the journey of becoming an English teacher, it felt important to do so in such a way that moved beyond the restraints of the past and enabled me to reflect on the journey as the writer and protagonist of my own story. To do this, I used a structure developed by Joseph Campbell called the hero's journey, a structure familiar across many works of literature. It begins when the main protagonist embarks on a journey of discovery, leaving all they have known behind, that is, the ordinary world. This departure follows a call to adventure, which leads them across the threshold into an unknown world where they meet an array of challenges and temptations. This initiation is about overcoming obstacles to the point of revelation and ultimate transformation. This then leads the protagonist to return to the beginning, this time as a changed person. It was this process that seemed to mirror my own educational journey. By becoming the main protagonist of my own story, I was able to be a participant and observer at the same time. I was born the year after Dixon's Growth Through English in 1967, when it was first published. As I was entering the school system in New Zealand, Dixon's book on the need for a child-centred approach to learning in English was influencing current teaching practice in the UK. As activities such as creative writing, talk and improvised drama were being prioritised within the English classroom, the Māori language was slowly being reintroduced into the New Zealand education system, having been banned since 1903. Our colonial past was being held to account. Our history classes in New Zealand were focused on the history of Britain, and our literature classes had been built around a canon of great British writers. Our curriculum, even our language, was not our own. New Zealand was like an outpost of Britain. It was this parent-child relationship. Paulo Freire describes this process as a form of banking, where the domination of a particular knowledge system relies on convincing those who have been invaded of their intrinsic inferiority. Things needed to change. Leaving New Zealand and physically crossing the oceans in 1991, travelling through Southeast Asia and arriving in Europe, felt as if I'd become the hero of my own story. No longer was I bound within a narrator's gaze. I was now free to experience and discover these new worlds for myself. Looking back, I think of the metaphorical links between the physicality of this newfound freedom and those freedoms which had been taken away by a prescriptive education system. Having a voice suddenly felt like a fundamental right. In Article 29 of the UNCRC, it speaks of the development of respect for the child's own cultural identity, language and values, for the national values of the country in which the child is living, the country from which he or she may originate. There was a growing awareness as I crossed that threshold that I had grown up in a colonised country where the purpose of English had been as a civilizing force, where Māori language had been banned and almost decimated, where we struggled under the weight of an inferiority complex. The stories, the culture, the language studied at secondary school were not our own. It was a sense of loss, and it would take years to understand what that meant and how to begin to reframe history. This growing awareness did not happen overnight. It began to happen in New Zealand when I took a paper on New Zealand literature as part of my postgraduate study. For the first time, New Zealand literature was an available paper as part of an English literature degree. But my awareness didn't develop much further than that, nor did it develop over the next 5 years as I was teaching English in secondary schools in England. It came, however, when I left teaching in the UK to work as a teacher trainer in Nepal for VSO, working initially alongside a local teacher in a rural village school in the east, before moving in my second year to run English teacher training courses for the Ministry of Education on a DFID funded education programme. It was here where I saw firsthand how the English textbooks used in schools promote a specific narrative. It was not just about teaching English in a village school where they were not able to learn to write in the language they spoke at home, but it was also the fact that these textbooks were not about Nepal. They were about adopting Western cultural practices. There was a strong element of disempowerment going on, a dumbing down of the local culture and favouring of this Western capitalist model. There are 101 ethnic groups in Nepal, speaking over 92 different languages. Very few of these languages are taught in their local schools. Nepali is a constructed language spoken by approximately 44.6% of the population. It is the first language taught in schools and the official native language of Nepal. However, the business language of Nepal is English. Education in the English language had been going on since the 1850s, a similar time to New Zealand. It soon became apparent that the English textbooks I was training the teachers in were a form of colonisation, using education as its medium and immediately drawing comparisons to the colonisation of Māori in New Zealand. But what also became clear was that this model was not only limited to different ethnicities, but was also a debate about class structure. Although England was not colonised, its state education system was still founded on a process of othering. The introduction of standard English and RP into the education system lies at the heart of educational discourse today. It seems that by not questioning whose English is it, we are left holding on to a legacy rather than an understanding. What is the way forward when we are surrounded by models that perpetuate a sense of uneven power relationships? How do we break down existing forms of our colonial past in order to ensure that all voices are heard? And what are some of the possibilities that I have personally come across that begin to open dialogue and a way forward? Well, coming from New Zealand, some of the things that have been happening within the New Zealand education system have shown a big connection between Māori learning and the European concept of learning. And as a result, new writing forms that allow silences to be broken. Things like the weaving pattern, weaving new strands together, enriching curriculum rather than this feeling of taking things away through change. The name Te Whariki comes from the Māori language and means woven mat. And this can be visualised as learning and development being woven from the principles, strands and goals. With the 4 principles: empowerment, children will be empowered to learn and grow; holistic development, children learn and grow in a holistic way. Their intellectual, social, cultural, physical, emotional and spiritual learning is interwoven across all their experiences. Another idea was in terms of the division of creative writing within English. How we find expression, how we find our voice, supporting teachers to develop their skills in creative writing so they can support students, linking creative writing within literature degrees as a way of understanding literature by doing, making choices like I did in this academic essay to link my own journey in education within a creative writing form. This hero's journey form structure was a way of bringing the story back to my own centre, my educational journey from my perspective. I found that the structure provided a framework in which I could tell my story, a unique journey. Writing itself is an art form, and therefore academic writing and creativity should be mutually inclusive. And finally, what it gave me was a new perspective, the ability to be objective about my own life, just as a writer would write about their protagonist. So had I turned my story into this journey where I was the main protagonist. It enabled me to step back and observe and connect in a way that was both liberating and incredibly powerful. It became a mechanism of expression, an acceptable format to give voice. And finally, just this quotation I just want to finish off with from Crystal. I hope children will grow up in a world in which people are given reasons for the way things are in language and are not expected to follow self-appointed authority blindly. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you so much. I think we have a lot of comments, and obviously we are open to question as well, if people would like to raise their hands. I shall start with some comments from the beginning of this session, with Livingston, who is referring to access to data. This is a question for, or a comment for Duncan. That data costs money to collect, synthesize and store. Very interesting that Duncan presenting. We covered these sessions in urban health and health in the city modules. Those of you here who have done these modules, there is more to learn from Duncan's presentation. I'm not sure if Duncan has something to add to that.
To be honest, Yolanda, I don't know what I could add to that.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah, that's fine. There are some more comments here from Maria saying, Maria said that she joined later. Thank you for insight into big data. So before we move to comments for the other two presenters, Duncan, you mentioned on one of the challenges, you say, obviously engaging with other professionals, and I think you mentioned GPs and some other health professionals to help you, or help one if he's embarking in this big data analysis, help you to make sense of the data. I just wanted to ask you, outside health professionals, what about some other, statistician or including artificial intelligence? Is there anything there that can help health professionals or researchers to make better sense?
Thank you, Yolanda. I think you're probably right. So I think to get the most from these sorts of data sources, now my experience is very narrow, so it's just focused on primary care records. It may be different for other types of data, but I actually think you need a team. Think of it as a team. So yes, to statisticians, yes, to general practitioners and possibly other people with kind of clinical backgrounds relevant to primary care. Yes, to people who have data processing expertise. So I'll give you an example. I've sort of at early stages of designing a project, and part of which involves CPRD data, and I intend to contract that out to a group in the University of Manchester who do this stuff all the time. So they do so much of it. They have access, live access to the data. So they spend the 200 grand a year to get live access, and they have a whole array of experts who do this kind of thing as a day job. And so it makes more sense to me to hand that over to a team like that, with additional input from statisticians and practitioners, as I say, rather than someone like me trying to do it on their own again. So that's what I had in mind, quite a breadth of collaborators, and that could involve AI applications potentially, but it's not something I know very much about.
Okay, thank you. So there are so many comments from students as well and colleagues in relation to the other two presentations. For Miranda, there's a lot of comments regarding stigma, microaggression is still very much happening in the UK among BMA, especially among Blacks. That was Sarah. Oluwakemi says, either way, people should treat one another with respect. Well done, Miranda, you're a brave Black lady. Very touching. I'm trying to find out. It's not easy yet, trust me. As I scroll down, trying to find if there are any particular questions. There are loads of comments. Brilliant stuff, good experience. Racial inequality is a big disease in our society at large, and it's difficult to wipe it out entirely, says Bankole. I don't know if, ladies, if you would like to comment on any of these chats. Please do, Miranda and Rachel. If you
yeah, just want to say thank you to everyone for the comments, because like from the comments are saying, it is quite a touchy thing to talk about, but I just spoke from the heart, and like I said, it was something that I experienced, and I just tried to convey that. And you know, it was a shock to the system, I say, in the sense that I found myself quite cultural aware and diverse. You know, born in Hackney, brought up in Tottenham. You know, I'm always exposed to diversity, and like I said, at first it's something I've just written off. I wrote it off, but when you're in it, when you're actually in it, it's just such a different thing. And even when I was reading about it, well, it was the other way around for me actually. So I experienced it and then read about it. So I didn't pair it up together until I then started working in it as well. So yeah, that's basically what I was going to add to that as well, if that makes any more sense.
Thanks, Miranda. Thank you. And it is also a thank you to Rachel. It shows the social power of language, says Amanda. Gosh, I see so many chats. That was inspiring. Well done, you. Very inspiring. Well done, Rachel. Alan saying thanks, Miranda and Rachel, pointing the way to the future. Rod Fonseca says, well done, Miranda and Rachel, very thoughtful pieces, a fabulous example of this year's PGCE group. And Kelly, thank you to everyone who has contributed today, our speakers and attendees. Okay, particulars. Thank you, Kelly. Thank you very much. Miranda, I don't know if you would like to add something about this comment on language that you received earlier. You can.
In what relation, sorry, Miranda?
It was a comment on language that I have lost. There was a comment on.
It might be for me, but it doesn't matter. I mean, it's the same, same sort of points, yeah. Really.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, to me, you know, just hearing from Miranda's powerful piece, it just sort of reminds me of the importance of stories. You know, the importance of personal stories and bringing those voices into the forefront and not being afraid to hear those and to use those stories as a way of making change. And I think, you know, one of the things that I've always been very sort of keen on, and the idea that, you know, sometimes in the academic world there's this tendency to narrow things down as you move ahead in academia, and I'm always concerned about that, because I always feel that You know, what are we afraid of? And, you know, this idea of bringing in different stories to help, you know, enrich what is possible, and enable different opportunities for people to speak, is what surely is what's so important, because at the end of the day, it's, you know, it's about empowerment, isn't it? It's about how we can help support to empower those voices, and to learn from everything, from each other.
I like the metaphor of waving that you mentioned, from Maori culture into the curriculum when you were addressing decolonizing, finding those ways, different ways or cultural ways, finding your own voice, as you said, in order to, well, bring your own voices, isn't it?
That's right, adding another strand to the weaving pattern rather than feeling that it's going to take away. Yeah.
Brilliant. I think I will encourage people, if they would like to come up with a microphone, if there is some other comment. I can only read. I apologize that I cannot go through all your comments. Janet, please, let me see, because I need to make you a presenter, I believe. Do you, Janet, bear with me a second. So go ahead, Janet, please. If you put your mic on, Janet.
Thank you, Yolanda. My comments were really to both the alumni from the PGCE 2019-20. And I have already written a message to Miranda. I hope that the research and the knowledge you have will empower you as you go out into the world of education as a Black teacher. But just to say, at London Met, we have just launched the Education Social Justice Framework, which will be looking at some of the things you've touched on. So it includes a strand of critical pedagogy as well as decolonizing. And Rachel, your presentation similarly touched on some of those strands. But I found your question, who's English? Holding on to legacy and not an understanding, quite a powerful message. So thank you both, and to my colleague and friend Alan, keep on doing the great work you're doing with your students. And Emma, lovely to hear your voice, and thank you too.
Thank you, Janet. Thank you very much. I'm not sure if Alan or Emma.
You're welcome.
And would like to reply to that.
Well, I mean, I can just say that thank you, Janet. And for us, I think it's very important to have this opportunity, and thank you, Yolanda, to share the work that our students have been doing, and to also share with other colleagues the sorts of strategies that we're taking to give students voice, and to give them a voice that they feel they can confidently use at this university and in the assignments that we've changed in order to give them that, and therefore go forward strongly as professional teachers in whatever schools they are, to use this voice confidently and for the benefit of all staff and students in the schools where they find themselves.
Okay,
I thought that was terrific. What you did, I thought that the voice from New Zealand, from the global south, was very, very powerful. And I thought that the way in which Miranda showed that the university organized in this way, and in the way that Janet has indicated moving forward, allows people to take their own experience, reframe it, and enrich it through academic study which shows the links that there are not only with colleagues like Nicola Rollock at Goldsmiths, but looking at our academic framework that doesn't just rely on Western European sources, but can move out to American writers like W.B. Du Bois and a range of other important voices spread across universities in the Global South.
Very true. Very true, and I know that you are interested in the Global South somehow, and at least we have some discussion in the past about it. And yes, definitely, it's very important to draw on those authors from the Global South. I mean, we say that because we are more used to refer to white European author most of the time, and is part of the process of the colonizing the curriculum, not only just to have a text sitting there as we were discussing this morning, but try to make sense and really incorporate somehow the perspective, and to help us find ways of expressing voices as well, different voices as well. It's academically speaking, right? And I think it's very important to try to bring those other voices or perspective into the curriculum